welcome to Westmapod, the Christie Time podcast about Agatha Christie's secret identity. I'm Mark Aldridge. I read and write about Agatha Christie a lot, including for my books Agatha Christie's Marple, Agatha Christie's Poirot, and, excitingly, the forthcoming The Swinging Christies, Agatha Christie in the 1960s, which is co-written with...
Hello, Gray Robert Brown here. I'm a writer and a Christie fan and a Westmacott fan, and I'm raring to go because this is Book 1, Episode 1, Giant Spread.
Yes.
This
is something that we've been thinking about for a really long time.
Yeah, this felt really irresistible, didn't it? And also, not only has it been a long time coming conceptually, but a long time coming. I mean, peek behind the curtain, listener. When did we record we recorded the intro episode about 8 months ago or something, didn't we?
It was a long time ago. But that was because we were so excited.
I think, and I've said this, I say this in the introduction episode as well, and this, if anyone hasn't caught it, it dropped a fortnight ago, so it should be on your feeds. But with The Swinging Christies, we came with a very set idea of what we wanted to talk about, whereas with Westmapod, we've decided to let Mary Westmacott show us what the path is. So I particularly wanted to, you were rereading it various times for other projects, but I wanted to particularly make sure that I'd recorded that episode before going back and reading any of them.
Yeah.
And also to keep it kind of fresh in our minds. So yeah, it's very exciting.
It is, yeah. It's been great to reread so many times, actually, because I've ended up... I think this is my third reading of Giant Spread in 2 years. You know, it's just, it's funny how often it comes
more than
around.
Ever before.
Certainly more than ever before. Yeah. My appreciation's only getting higher every time.
Same, I think. Yeah. Okay, let's crack on. Giant Spread is the story of Vernon Dare, a naive but ambitious young man who wants nothing more than to reconcile himself with the house he grew up in, Abbots Pousson. His childhood hatred of music becomes an adult obsession. We follow Vernon along with his friends Sebastian Levin, Josephine Waite and Nell Verica as they come of age and navigate family, love, money, loss, until the coming of war changes everything. Is Vernon truly a genius? And will he ever make the music to prove that? Oh, and we should clarify actually that, because in the intro episode, as we said, we recorded it a while ago, I think we mentioned that it's such a shame that there's been a checkered history in the US in terms of availability of these books, because we have a lot of US listeners. Hi if you're listening. That's no longer the case.
No, they've been slowly re-released in ebook and then paperback. But that's really good timing. Thank you very much.
So I think I'm right in saying by the time this drops, they'll all be out.
They will.
So
yes,
they
will.
Yeah, but they're coming now at time of recording. So let's talk a little about the context of Giant Spread. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was published on the 14th of April, which is today. There is method to our madness, isn't there, Mark?
Yes.
Annoyingly, it's 96 years ago. It's let's say it's almost 100 years ago.
Do you know, people said
up.
That to me about like my Marple book. They're like, "Oh, what's that celebration the centenary of?" Like, it's not.
Yeah,
I'm not going to keep it back for a couple of years just because that would match 100 years nicely.
Yeah. Maybe we should have held it. No, we're too
re-released with bonus features.
Exactly.
That's the way it's done in this century.
Although that does bring me to thinking. This book does not feel like 100 years old, and that is a real point in its favour. Actually, it does. That's a really quite a startling reminder. Actually, so we know Mary Westmacott is Agatha Christie, although we will be questioning her identity in other more abstract ways as the series goes on. What does she stand for as Mary Westmacott? Why did she choose to write under a pseudonym? Why did she choose to write separate novels?
There are a few reasons for that. I think that she was already starting to feel a little bit hemmed in by expectations of what an Agatha Christie would be. Well, she said later to Julian Simmons in the 60s, actually, which ties in nicely with our other podcast, that she liked...
I know, I keep finding things that are 60s related. In fact, there's some bits later on in the episode where I want to talk about 60s things. It's like we can't escape. It'll always have a special place in our heart.
But she said that, "I think it is better to keep the two sorts of books separate. I like keeping them to myself too, so that I can write exactly what I like." She does send a copy of Giant Spread to Max in 1930, so they're not quite married yet. So we were saying in the first episode, in the introduction episode, to say, about the fact that these were written after she and Archie were no more. But she hasn't quite married Max at this point either. So we're slightly in sort of limbo in terms of her sort of name.
Yes.
But she's still very much in the sort of, throes of love, early love, young love, when she's writing these lovely letters to Max in 1930.
But backtrack. So she wants to keep the books separate.
Yes.
They're a different mode of writing.
Yes.
They've historically been massively kind of misunderstood and mislabeled and misattributed as a result of this, right?
Especially in the republications in the 60s, where they would often say that they were romances. And if you look at lots of those covers, they are almost all of couples and sort of, exchanging flowers and stuff like that.
Yes.
You're like, it's not that you couldn't say that there isn't a moment of love in all of these Westmacotts, but you can't say that they are romance novels.
No, I mean, a lot of the love that's primarily on display are not romantic relationships. I mean, this book in a huge way is about friendship. A Daughter's a Daughter is, funnily enough, in many ways not that romantic, and in many ways about a mother and daughter. Absolutely. Which we'll come on to in a few weeks. Yeah, and then I think there's been a bit of a pushback against that to define them as, well, at one point it seemed quite popular to call them like emotional thrillers or like psychological thrillers, which I also think is not true.
I always call them sort of character dramas, but I mean, then you're just sort of talking literary novels.
I think that's it. Yeah, we've talked about this before, haven't we? I think as soon as you start going, well, you define them by their characters or their emotions, well, that is just a literary novel. That's just a novel. And actually maybe our obsession, not ours, but the world's obsession with trying to categorize writing in this way is just completely arbitrary.
It is, and I think especially because of Agatha, that you would go, well, she's a genre writer.
Yes.
So what genre is this? Where can we put this? Quite clearly say you're trying a different genre.
In fact, I noted only on page 171 of my copy is when I felt like the romance plot actually kicks in.
Which is about the point that usually you're wrapping up an Agatha Christie
Exactly,
novel.
That's true. But that means there's 170 pages before you even get to what these books have been sort of pegged as in some quarters. And I can't believe anything other than siphoning them off as romance novels or calling them things like emotional is on some level dismissive, dare I say, low-key misogynistic, and just trying to kind of make them seem lesser than the sophisticated books that they are.
I mean, Agatha saw these as real outlets, that they would think that's a big part of why they were secret, is that she says it again in this Julian Simmons interview. She goes, it's an entirely emotional reason. She's saying it's clearly not a commercial reason for doing it. It's just that she likes to keep them to herself.
Oh, there's no money in literary novels.
That letter I was saying about to Max, she even says, don't even tell your mother. That's how much, don't tell anybody. It's like, it's very, very few people who knew about it.
So in the autobiography, she describes the feeling of wanting to write Giant's Bread as rather guilty, and she wanted to express her long-standing love of music, which we'll come on to, is a major theme of the book. But for this kind of project to come off, she needed a pseudonym, right? So how does she alight on the name Mary Westmacott? What's the significance of Mary Westmacott?
Well, for this, we'll go to Rosalind Hicks, Agatha's daughter, who in 1990 wrote a short article about the Mary Westmacott books. 1990 was 100 years since Agatha Christie's birth. Lots going on that year. Lovely book, centenary book, was published that year. And look, I'm going to rustle, because I've actually got it here. So
not the Foley. Not sound effects.
But it's funny how even in 1990 she talks about Mary Westmacott as if it's some sort of secret, like, did you know she also wrote these 6 books? Because it's before the internet, before I think there were so many people internationally talking about Agatha Christie who could communicate about her. Perhaps it wasn't so well known. She says, the name Mary Westmacott was chosen after some thought. Mary was Agatha's second name and Westmacott the name of some distant relatives. So that's, I mean, it's funny because when I went to the family archive once, they had a big family tree out. And I noticed a name that it wasn't Westmacott, but it was very similar to it. And I said, there's a... And they said, no, it's not quite Westmacott. It's actually something else. So this is, maybe people who know their heritage websites better than me could look up this. But I even wonder if she might have actually misread it slightly.
Maybe.
That Westmacott might be a version of the names of some distant relatives.
Yeah.
But I'm very, very happy to be corrected. If someone's great on their ancestry.com and can find how the Westmacotts are actually related to the Millers, I guess it would be really...
Yeah.
Then that would be really interesting.
Yeah. We'll talk a bit more about the sort of Easter eggs that we can find within the Mary Westmacott books as Agatha fans, both in terms of nuggets of her life, which are plenty, but also in terms of what feel like little references to work or, you know, names that she's had buzzing around her head or whatever it may be. But she does use the surname Narracott, and I do think with the suffix of cott, I'm sure, again, someone who knows more about this stuff right in, I'm sure that is Devonshire specific, and Narracott is in Sitterford Mystery, Devon Set, but also West. She toys with West as a surname,
yes.
And West, of course, is relevant to us as Agatha fans because Raymond
West, yes.
So Marple's nephew, who she would have just created very shortly before starting work on Giant's Bread. You know, whatever we may think about Raymond, I personally think he's a bit of a cad. He is a pivotal character in the canon, given that he is a family relation of, you know, he's family, like as in that sense that Miss Marple is so prominent in the Agatha universe.
There's an Narracott in, and then there were none as well, isn't there?
Oh, of course there is,
and
yeah.
that's just obviously Devon.
As per Janet Morgan, Agatha is drafting this first Mary Westmacott book. I should say Mary is writing Giant's Bread in 1928. It publishes in, as we said, April 1930. So what's going on in the twin lives of Agatha Christie and Mary Westmacott?
If you just look at what's published, we've got Mystery of the Blue Train, 1928, Seven Dials Mystery, 29, Murder at the Vicarage in 1930, Sitterford Mystery, 31. Short stories like the Mr. Quinn collection, although most of them were written earlier. She's also doing this stuff with the Detection Club for the BBC. She's collaborating on these mysteries. So she's very busy, and they're all quite different, those things. We've got thrillers, we've got Poirot mysteries, we've got Miss Marple, we've got a standalone with the Sitterford mystery, and of course the wonderful Mr. Quinn's. So she's spreading her wings a bit around this time, I think.
Which makes sense for them writing in a different mode, writing under a different name. You alluded to it earlier, but she's in this limbo period between the breakdown of her marriage in 26, early 27, and marrying again later in 1930 than where we are. And Giant's Bread does feel very much like a product of that time, something where she very readily remembers the events of 1926. For those who don't know, although I'm sure this is at least even the most casual Agatha fan knows stuff about this, but Christie had a breakdown in 1926, very difficult time for all involved. Her mum passed away, her husband was unfaithful, and they broke up, and you can absolutely see the ghost of those events in this book. In fact, Thompson calls starting the Mary Westmacotts as perhaps a bit of a sombre celebration of a new beginning. And I do think there's a lot in that. We should say Laura Thompson is one of the main biographers of Agatha Christie, and in a way her sort of unofficial thesis is the thing that she keeps coming back to is, if you want to know the real Agatha Christie, read the Mary Westmacotts, because that's where she's at her most exposed and vulnerable. And I do think there's a very compelling argument to mount that Christie starts writing under Mary Westmacott because she feels like she can be more honest about autobiographical matters than, you know, let's not forget the press were all over her in 26 and 27, right? And there was all this speculation as to, is it a publicity stunt? Why has she done this? What's she thinking? So then people are flocking to her subsequent books, right, for the few years after that, picking for answers, and she's continually asked in interviews and all that stuff. So you can see why you'd go, I want the cover of a name, cover of an alibi, but the freedom of being able to say what I want to say about the truth of how I feel.
I completely agree. And the reason why she's writing so much at this time is also because she's got to provide for Rosalind and herself. And she knows that, I guess, she is writing, not necessarily to order, but she's writing books that she knows her publisher's going to want, and they're likely to make some money from things like magazine publications. So Poirot stories, Miss Marple, and so on. So it makes sense that you would want a little bit of respite from that and go, look, I still want to be creative, but perhaps I can do something that is just for me. So there are definitely autobiographical elements in Giant's Bread.
So many.
Yes, and I didn't want us to be too waylaid by just saying, oh, and this is just like Agatha's real life.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. And actually, I've got the perfect example for exactly what you're saying, which is that, did you notice that she's very clear that Vernon goes to school, but it almost felt like Agatha was sort of coming out of the page and going, hold on. Because it is annoying when people just equate stuff to biography. And I know that fiction writers get very frustrated by that because it is more complicated than that. And it is more of a smash and grab and a remix. And that's a great example of where her and Vernon's life deviate in quite a big way, I think. Because, of course, Agatha had no formal education, and she was known to say that the education she had was music, which is relevant. But yeah, so go on, give me what you spotted.
So things like Vernon having these fantasy characters in childhood, and there's even a suggestion that he could write these fantasies up. Obviously, this is like Agatha in her early life, so she would have sort of imaginary friends. And of course, once you've got a mention of mauve irises on his wallpaper, that thing about the floral wallpaper that recurs several times that Agatha clearly remembered from her own nursery. Things like money issues that there were in the family.
Yep.
This is always sort
specifically because of the father not being very good at managing money.
I think that's right. Which reminds me, like Vernon's dad, there were sometimes points where it felt like, but Archie is told through unfinished portrait.
Oh, interesting.
But that thing of like being slightly distant, not quite sure what to do with children, and like being quite prescriptive about what he wants a child to be.
So Unfinished Portrait is the next Mary Westmacott novel. So I'd be interested, I've not reread that one yet because I'm doing them as we go. So I'd be interested to think about what you've just said when we get there.
Vernon and Nell marry at the beginning of the war, which is exactly what Agatha and Archie did, of course.
Yeah, and didn't Rosalind also have a war wedding?
Well, yeah, she and Hubert got married.
Yeah,
yes,
obviously that's after.
Yes.
And also then it's not just them. They're not alone in that.
Exactly, no. And there's a few of these things that you're going to go, well, it's not only Agatha that had imaginary friends, and it's not only Agatha got married.
No, but it's not about that.
And both Nell and Agatha were both VAD nurses. There's stories that we hear about being a VAD nurse that actually come out later in Agatha's autobiography.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that there's a story about taking a leg to the furnace, that this being a really quite harrowing thing. But in Giant's Bread, it's our sort of protagonist. It's Nell who has to do it. But in the autobiography, Agatha relaying when she had to tell a probationer to do it.
Oh, yes.
So she says, I remember a young probationer who had been assisting the theatre and had been left behind to clear up, and I had helped her take an amputated leg down to throw into the furnace. It was almost too much for the child.
But yeah, I thought several of Nell's war experiences felt very lived.
Yes.
There was one beautiful moment where she feels the coming of the war because she starts to see placards and like anxious queues at the grocery shops and sort of can feel the clouds gathering. And the narrator says, a train journey where the ticket office refused to change a £5 note proved to be the turning point. Ridiculous, but there it was. That was when she knew that this is serious and war is really coming.
Yes.
And that's such a lived detail. You wouldn't get that from just poring over, dry history books. That feels really close and emotional.
No, you're right. The other major thing that I noticed was Abbott's Puissant itself, the house and the grounds. It was just so Ashfield. I mean, not in terms of its description, but the way that it is so central and important to people. Like that,
how much he yearns for it.
Yeah, he yearns for it, and that whatever happens, it must be protected. That it's part of the family. I thought that was really interesting.
Definitely, Vernon's longing to secure the house and to get back to the house, and indeed, I'll talk about this in a minute. But the narrative returns us to that house as a cipher for, what he feels about family and home and everything. Yeah, that felt very much like the way that Agatha talks about Ashfield or close stand-ins for Ashfield in various books. Even like bits of Poston of Fate where she's remembering her childhood in Ashfield felt very similar to this, yeah. So Janet Morgan points out that the character of Jane, who's a singer, I think she refers to her also acting or being an actor.
Yes.
And I was like, an actor called Jane. Yeah. Oh my God. Catherine Brobeck's nemesis. But Janet Morgan points out that Jane is a soprano who devotes her career to post-Wagnerian roles, which are exactly the roles that Agatha always wanted to sing, and the voice that she had, or kind of could have had, I guess. I thought the bit where Vernon's mum, and I'm using the word in the book here, hysterical in response to being cheated on, essentially, felt like Agatha almost deriding herself for her reaction. Sometimes she's very, I guess we all are, sometimes she's very unfair on herself, given what she's been through. There's not that much sympathy for Myra as a character, but actually what her experience is not dissimilar to what Agatha's just gone through. You mentioned that there are shadows of Archie in there, and there's a point where Vernon says to Nell of her VAD work that it's a filthy job nursing, and I'm fairly sure that that's almost exactly what Archie says to Agatha. I hate to think of your doing it, Vernon says.
Yeah.
If not a direct quote, then very close. And yeah, in terms of where Christie is post-disappearance, there are just a few other points I wanted to mention. Just quite a few little mentions of quote-unquote spinsterhood. And that takes on a whole new relevance when you think not only is Christie, maybe she's thinking about what if I never marry again, which was a real possibility.
I think that was what she thought was the most likely
scenario. Yeah, especially when you remember, as we've said, that it was written in 28 rather than... They even play the card game Old Maid at one point, which, what did they call it on The Traitors? This is a complete side note. Do you remember they did that bit where they took them out to some place and they had to not have the death card?
Oh, yeah.
Death match.
Yes.
But it's just Old Maid. Or as Johnny and I call it, we play it quite a lot, me and my partner, and we call it Scabby Queen, which is like an alternate title. But creating Miss Marple around this time as well. So thinking about a quote-unquote spinster character and somebody with the name West, who is a spinster. And not just that, but this is a nice way to tie it all together, actually. The person who owns the piano that scares the living daylights out of Vernon in that very early part of the book is called Mrs. Summers West.
Oh.
And, that's pivotal. That's his, catalyst, isn't it? In terms of what feel, in retrospect, like references to Agatha's other work, there's quite a few little gems for us to find as well.
You can't help but sort of go, yay.
Yeah.
Come tell me how you lived. The quote is there, which obviously becomes her archaeological memoir.
Yeah.
So that's the main one that I noticed. You picked up on some others too.
Yeah, well, just things like there are a couple of Christies, and we won't name them for spoiler reasons, where a husband comes back from the dead, or, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Someone remarries, but they've actually remarried. Well, I'll leave it there. When Vernon's young, he naively one of the kind of naive comments he makes is that God's name is Mr. Robinson. And Mr. Robinson is a recurring character through the swinging texts. Yeah. And also, which I think is relevant because Mr. Robinson he's quite a bit of a cipher in those books, and he's supposed to be this authoritarian figure that's a bit remove. And of course, that's what God is, right?
Yeah.
Sunken Garden. We've been fascinated by Sunken Gardens recently, haven't we? Most notably in Halloween Party, but in various Christies. There's a point where they think the Levins have a swimming pool, and then they're corrected. No, it's a Sunken Garden. Sebastian Levin wants to go and run a picture gallery in Bond Street, and there's a whole passage in Endless Night where he talks about walking down Bond Street and looking in the art shops, thinking about the fancy clothes that he would buy if he was rich. And
very Endless Night.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Morgan says this as well. Mike and Santonix, there are shadows of them in Vernon and Sebastian.
I agree.
Their relationship.
Yes.
Not least because Vernon becomes a mysterious chauffeur, which of course Mike is towards the beginning of Endless Night. But perhaps most prominently, although not a specific reference, but I just felt like the whole book felt to me very much in conversation with The Secret Adversary in terms of the political backdrop. So it's another book where she's wrestling with the kind of rising up of post-Russian Revolution fervour, socialist fervour. And this feels very much like a post-general strike book, a book that's concerned about Bolshevism and the upending of the world order, but also in that The Secret Adversary begins with the sinking of the Lusitania, and of course this book ends with the sinking of a ship.
I noted, and I'm not the first person to note, that this also picks up on themes in a couple of her earlier short stories, While the Light Lasts and Within a Wall in particular, to While the Light Lasts. I don't think I'll ruin While the Light Lasts if people haven't read it, but it uses a same character twist in it that there is in Giant's Bread. You'll know it when you read it, just because I don't think many people have read these compared to our mysteries. And Within a Wall, which is very much about an artist's vision being made visible through their work, and that like their life is very much expressed through their work and the way that they live their life through their artistry. In that case, it's a painter and a drawer. Yeah, still the same principle.
Yeah, and Swan Song as well.
Swan Song, yeah, which is very much about, well, that's got a real, it's funny, I saw something the other day that was all very Swan Song. It was what was I watching? It was a modern mystery. I think it was Elspeth, which basically remade Swan Song. The Agatha Christie story. Yeah, it's a spin-off of The Good Wife and Good Fight. It's like Columbo. It's really good. But that had an episode of Nathan Lane in it, who goes to this theatre every night. So he's inspired by Tosca and he uses a knife from Tosca to commit the crime. We know this. He was told it right at the beginning. It's not. It's all about how the crime's investigated. But I was like, oh, good, they're doing Swan Song, but then they're really just doing Tosca. But then that's Agatha was doing. But yeah, that link between like your passion for your art and it sort of manifesting itself in some way.
Yeah, definitely. All of this leads us very neatly on just to talk briefly about the historical context here as well. My little theory, I don't think we talked about this yesterday, it doesn't specify, but my theory is that we're supposed to believe that the book begins in 1890, or that Vernon was born in 1890, which is obviously the year that Agatha Christie is born, and that would mean that he's 9 when his dad goes off to fight in the Second Boer War in 1899, which we cover. That runs to 1902. The First World War is very pivotal to the book, 1914 to 18. Obviously, you've got the Russian Revolution in the middle of that in 17, which I mentioned just now, and the General Strike. And did you notice, and this is not a post-General Strike thing, but I felt like the anxieties of... Because basically with the General Strike, there was this fear that there was going to be an English Revolution, that the lower classes were going to upturn. And it was felt that the First World War, in many ways, you were fighting for the old world order, right? And there's that bit where the new maid arrives and she's called Isabel, but they're not allowed to call her Isabel because Isabel is a name with ideas above its station.
It's not a maid's
name. So she has to be called Susan. And Isabel seems quite bolshy, and she says something, she sort of goes, oh, people have got to do what they're told in this world at one point, and it's clearly she's buffing against that. And I also wanted to mention the obscenity trial for The Well of Loneliness. So The Well of Loneliness is a lesbian novel by Radcliffe Hall, and it was published in 1928, and it was taken to trial for obscenity. So one of the big aspects of the press coverage at the time, and one of the factors in determining whether or not it should be banned or not, was they were to take into account literary genius, essentially. Like if you could prove that it was genius, then it was allowed to get away with quote unquote obscenity, which feels like that being in the ether in 28-29 when Agatha's writing Giant's Bread is an interesting factor, I think. And actually you might have a point later that ties into that, but cliffhanger. So I'd like to talk just a bit more generally about the way the book is presented, if I may, Dr. Mark Aldridge. So the title, Giant's Bread, is of course a reference. It's funny because it's almost a nursery rhyme title, which at this point in her career, Christie is not really doing. A couple of maybe examples, but obviously becomes post and then the Nun really becomes the order of the day. I think a strong argument for the book being a literary novel is how much thought has gone into the structure of it, and actually how atypical the structure is. Like it's quite unlike the sort of structure that Christie would normally invoke. Yes. It's a lot longer, for one thing, as you've said. But so we have, if I could just walk us through, so we have the prologue, which is actually set towards the end of the book, and then we flash back. And I could only think of Sad Cypress as an example where Christie's dabbled with this kind of thing. Don't know if any occurred to you. Off the top of my
head, I can't think.
But it's certainly pretty atypical in crime. And
I guess you have things like Murder in Mesopotamia and stuff, where it's sort of like, oh, I've been asked to write this, and here is... Because it's the same sort of principle, isn't it?
That's
that
true.
You're sort of looking back and going, well, now is the time to tell this. So there's a few that do it a little bit like that,
Yeah.
but not in the same way, I think, as we get in Giant's Bread.
Yeah. I think what it allows, which is very clever, and again, a very literary technique, is it allows for a lot of dramatic irony. Like, I couldn't stop spotting these, you know, things like Vernon would never leave Abbott's Poussin, and you go, he's going to. Or, you know, Vernon hated music and he would never like music, and you go, you know, and there's lots of points where the reader knows more than the characters do, which is, of course, the definition of dramatic irony, and a lot of invoking of foreshadowing at various points. Because you don't really foreshadow in a detective novel. What you do more in a detective novel is clue, right? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like her version of, she can't really do clues because it's not really working on that level, but she can put different kinds of literary hints in, and that's what the foreshadowing are. Do you know what I mean?
I do, yeah, absolutely. The idea of, if you're paying attention, this will mean more to you. But if you're not paying attention, you can just go with the flow.
Yeah.
But if you are, then
yeah,
there's an extra little gift for you.
Completely. Yeah. Case in point, in the prologue, we meet Sebastian, and he is presenting us. He's a kind of impresario. But you then go into part one, not really knowing the relevance of what you've heard, and it becomes apparent to you later on as you move through. So part one is named after the house, Abbots Poussin, and we have, immediately you're introduced, there were three people so it's Vernon that we're following, Vernon Dare, who is a boy, and we're going to follow his life basically in quite a sort of classic novel fashion, quite Dickensian actually. He gave me Pip from Great Expectations.
Yes, I agree.
And that's not the last comparison I'll make there. And you meet it says three people of real importance in Vernon's world: Nurse, God, and Mr. Green. And Mr. Green is one of his, you mentioned before, one of his sort of imaginary figures. I think the others are tree and squirrel. But of course, you're starting to piece together, you're going, Green, the man that had composed the opera in the prologue, his surname is spelt Groen, which, if you're a very informed reader, you will know is the Dutch word for green, which may or may not be relevant as we come on. It certainly sounds like green, and then you're going giants and God, and it's all this layering that she's doing. Who is the giant of Vernon's life? You know, is it Mr. Green? Who is his main influence? Is his own genius going to be his giant? You know, things like he's talking about who he might want to marry. And then as we build to the end of this part, we start looking back at Nurse and God and Mr. Green. So it's all kind of tying together. Yeah. And we introduce Nell towards the end of this part. We then pass the baton to part two is called Nell, and then we cycle through to her. We spend a bit more time with Sebastian. We're starting to understand his relevance. There's even, I think, there's even at the end of a chapter in part two, the narrator says, 21, Abbots Poussin, music. And it's almost like reiterating these themes that we're following, you know, this point that we're building towards. Re-enter Nell, as I said, you've got the characters starting to move in. We meet Jane for the first time. Jane, who is a bit of a no-nonsense soprano.
Terrible quotes that's on the back cover of all of the editions.
Which is?
With the chapters in which Jane appears are worth the rest of the book put together. It's like, that's not a positive quote. Don't put that on the book.
And you sort of go, if that was the best point of the reviews, that's selling the book short, I think.
It really is, yeah.
Although, do you fully disagree? Because Jane is a great character.
No. Oh, well, I do fully disagree, because I wouldn't say it's worth the rest of the book put together.
That's true.
I would say that it's a highlight.
Yeah. But I mean, for example, so one of the things, so Jane literally just walks in and punctures the book, doesn't she? She goes, you do expect life to be rather a fairy story, don't you, to Vernon? And it does feel like we're being told a fairy story. The fairy story is sort of what goes on to be written as the opera. And she goes, you want to be able to live in the house of your forefathers and to marry the girl you love and to grow immensely rich and to be a great composer. I dare say you might manage to do one of those four things, but it's not likely that you'll have everything, you know. Life isn't like a penny novelette. And of course, one of the criticisms of this book is that as you get towards the end, it does become, maybe it tips towards sort of melodrama. Yeah. But I think that's Christie going, that's where we're heading. We're going to start writing in that mode towards the end. It's going to be aping a penny novelette. And Jane tells us that. So then Jane is rewarded with the next section. Section 3 is Jane. We've only just met her, and now the storytelling baton is kind of passed to her. They're now kind of like young London friends, aren't they? And they're almost like the Bloomsbury set, you know, like Wolfian, and kind of, Jane says at one point, friendship is not a kind of equilateral triangle. If A likes B and loves C, etc., etc., you know, and that's how all the characters are moving at that point, aren't they? It's like, who's going to fall in love with who, and who's going to end up with, is she then not going to like her? And that's the plot version of what the structure's doing, which is passing us from person to person to person in this kind of living in square and loving in triangles kind of structure. Then we start to get mentions of Chamberlain and the Sir Dutton land and the League of Nations, so we know that we're passing the baton towards part 4,
war,
which is war. Yeah, and then we learn in the prologue that the composer of Giant's Bread was killed in the First World War, so we have good reason to be very, that's the foreshadowing.
We've always known we were heading towards that.
Exactly, and it's the dread of that. And by this point, we're fairly certain that somehow Vernon Dare is going to end up having been all the time the composer of Giant's Bread, even though he's got a different name. We can't quite reconcile that yet. But we're worried for Vernon at this point, and his father died in the Boer War. You know, all these, like I say, these moments of foreshadowing, this ticking over of this structure that's very meticulously done. Towards the end of this section, we prepare to pass the baton of perspective again in this kind of Dickensian or almost Victor Hugo style chapter opener, which goes, in the town of A, in Holland, not far from the German frontier, is an inconspicuous inn. Here, on a certain evening in 1917, a dark young man with a haggard face pushed open the door and in very halting Dutch asked for a lodging for the night. And of course, this turns out to be Vernon, who is not dead after all, but has survived. And he is then put on notice of a Corporal Green.
Yes.
Another Green. You're going, Mr. Green, Boris Groen, what's going on here? It seems to be another character. Also, probably any reader has flicked past the contents page and is seeing that, is already aware that the next part, which is the last part, is named George Green. You're going, oh, is Corporal Green George Green? I don't know. It's a kind of like a lost lover of someone that he meets, isn't it? And then part 5, George Green, this is where it all comes together. It's almost like we've combined multiple characters, you know, like a Frankenstein's character, because we've got George, as in George Chetwin, we've got Green, like Mr. Green, and that's the identity that Vernon's kind of taken on because he's lost his memory, and it's his war identity. And Nell now has 2 Georges to pick from, which I felt like there was some, I don't know, there's something in that around how Agatha signed into the Harrogate Hotel when she was having her breakdown under the name of Archie's mistress. Yeah. When you read the context, you think, okay, so the last chapter is going to be about his imaginary friend. It's almost like his imaginary friend has become manifest through the book. But of course it isn't. It's Vernon, and that's where we started. And we go back to the start. We go back to talking about Abbot's Pousson. You know, you've got things like when Jane drowns, she goes down into that green swirl. You know, it's all these references are coming together. And even the fact that he has 4 imaginary friends, and then the 4 friends in the book sort of mirror that, right? But yeah, and I just want to say in terms of Dickens, so it's there's definitely great expectation stuff there, and the way that Vernon and Jane and Vernon and Nell relate to each other that feels like Pip and Estella. And I felt like the ending felt like Christie's version of one of the endings of Great Expectations. But also, A Christmas Carol is written in 5 parts that are called staves to mirror the lines that music notes are on. Yes. And that's what Giant's Bread is written in 5 parts, the 5 staves. Christie is a huge fan of Dickens, isn't she? So there's definitely something in this.
It was interesting that many years later, when she wrote her final book, Poison of Fate, she was really opposed to the way that it was originally laid out that made it look like it was in parts. So it's like she really thinks about her structure. Like, this isn't an accident. It's not like the publisher Collins have gone, oh, well, we'll just split it like this rather than calling them chapters. But she really thought about stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely.
And also her chapter, or in this case, part titles. The way that they're just character names, well, plus war, really. But
who is a character in and of himself.
Yes, yeah. But I thought that was really interesting that it's just to say, like a little pointer.
Yeah.
There are no spoilers here. It's just going to give you a hint.
You know, the contents page is paratextual, right? It's as important, I think, in terms of your experience of the book. As is the cover. I mean, the first edition cover we love, don't we?
Absolutely adore it.
It's this kind of modernist...
Yeah, very much. It's sort of cogs and...
yeah, almost like the cogs of his genius.
Yes.
And it's funny, it's modernist in the way that the early David Suchet Poirot series was really gunning for that kind of modernism, you know, that kind of Art Deco.
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of Salvador Dali's films, in particular, things like Un Chien Andalou, and just this idea that lots of different elements thrown together, and you can work out for yourself which bits you want to pick out as being most significant.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it reminded me that even of things like Modern Times, you know, there's so much there that is just saying, you know, that the industry, but also it's almost like the cog is grinding up the instruments, isn't it?
Well, and that's how the opera is described, isn't it? It's the
clanking
sort of
machinery,
and the giant being this march of progress, which I think is the sort of beast or spectre of Bolshevism, and the music and the genius and
beautiful representation of
it.
that.
It very much fits. Courtesy of Collecting Christie, friend of the podcast, the designer is Margaret McAdam, who was a big feminist and a modernist, and she was. I thought this was interesting. I think David talked about this in the Torquay Festival last year, but she was also a VAD nurse, which is fitting for such a, as we say, a sort of autobiographical book.
Yes.
So we're just going to go through some of the key themes, I guess, of the book.
Yes.
Theme by theme. The first of which, I suppose, could be characterised as music and genius.
Yes, and this is obviously absolutely integral. There's a real sort of honesty to his genius, and it comes out very, very naturally, and other people recognise it in him.
Yeah, I think Westmacott is clever about the nature of genius in that respect, which is that it's not unanimous that he is one, or that there is such a thing. And I think it would be very easy for a book to come down either way. And actually, it's the pursuit of it, right? Which is how we leave him. That's the very end of the book, is still pursuing that dream of getting it right. Yeah, there's a bit where you sort of hear from the various people discussing the relative merits of his opera, and some of them think it's Cubist masterpiece and other them think it's completely incomprehensible.
It reminded me of, you like Pet Shop Boys, don't you?
I love the Pet Shop Boys.
Yesterday when I was mad. Darling, it was wonderful. You really were quite good. Of course, no one understood. And it's this whole thing about after a show, the sort of things that people come and say to them, which is wonderful. Of course, nobody else understood it. It just reminded me of that right at the beginning. And then it's got Neil going, "You're much too kind. I smiled with murder on my mind."
Very Christie.
Yeah. He obviously hates the piano. He was terrified of the piano.
Yeah,
right
the beast.
At the beginning. The beast, yes.
Which is a recurrent symbol, and Westmacott reiterates that word as well. It gets several people at various points, Jane and Nell, I think, are like, "Oh, I'm behaving beastly," and you know, the repetition is used to reinforce that, I think.
Yeah, and I think that just makes it feel more like it is a divine moment, that suddenly he is struck by this genius, and that actually overnight he absolutely changes his perspective.
He basically says, I still think, quote, "little bits of it are ugly. It's like going up to a picture and seeing a nasty grey smear of paint, but go to a distance and it falls into place as the most wonderful shadow. It's got to be a whole. I still think one violin's ugly and a piano is beastly," that word again, "but useful in a way, I suppose, because for him it's about the whole orchestra coming together, the whole piece coming together and being greater than the sum of its parts." And I think that was really clever, because I expected actually to find it slightly unconvincing that someone would go from being so vehemently opposed to music to suddenly thinking that it should be their life's work. Westmacott's clever to justify it. Sorry, on that note, Jo points out, and she's right, and it made me laugh, that she's like, most people are just a bit indifferent to music, but he like hates it.
Yes.
And it is true.
Yes.
It's quite funny actually how, yeah, it's true. Like a lot of people are just like, oh, it's not for me, but you know, whatever. But he's like, no, I can't stand it.
It's funny that when I reread it for the first time a little while ago, if that makes sense, so I hadn't read it for a long time, right at the beginning, it struck me how lots of the descriptions of Vernon, the way he hated noise and sound and music, I was like, if you were to write this now, I think you would lean into him perhaps being diagnosed as autistic, because there are real elements of that, of his sort of focus on particular aspects,
Definitely.
the way that, you know, he communicates with people. So we should never diagnose people, even fictional characters, without sort of meeting them with a medical professional. But I think that there are hints there of that, the type of person who can be overwhelmed by something.
Not so much a diagnosis, but I think there's a neurodivergent reading to be had. Yeah, definitely. I think that's completely valid reading.
We're foleying because I'm actually physically getting a letter out. So I was struck by the fact that genius, the way that Vernon can see the world in different ways, it's sort, you know, the whole world whizzing by him and everything. In 1930, I've got this copy of this letter here. We think in 1930, it's ascribed to 1930 by Janet Morgan. It's not actually dated. It's 14th of November, but it's a letter that Agatha wrote to Max, which we have referred to, I think, in one of our episodes. But I just thought, I'm not going to read it all out, but I've got it in front of me to remind myself that she talks to him about Sir James Jeans's The Mysterious Universe, and about this idea of God being in the future and that we're all rushing towards it, and that what it would be like to see the world as if it's a cinema film being run backwards. If time is infinite, it would be the same thing. We could move through it either way. All of this stuff about her just suddenly seeing the universe in a different way struck me as so like what Vernon... How Vernon sees the world,
scales falling from his eyes moment. Yeah. Well, we've used it to talk about the unknown aspect of Christie's writing, which is her propensity for sci-fi.
Yes.
But also it's literary as well. That's what we've been talking about in terms of the structure. You know, the way that you're both in conversation with the future and the past. You're in conversation with World War I and marching towards there, knowing that the protagonist is going to die, whilst also being in conversation with the 100 pages after that where you reveal that he hasn't died, and there's this, and you know, and the layering that's going on there.
Several of the reviews mentioned how difficult it is to write a book about a genius, and actually a couple of them said, and Mary Westmacott hasn't done it. She hasn't managed to write it.
I disagree.
But they say, but she comes close.
Yeah,
they're saying that it's very difficult to actually do that.
I think what Westmacott does, which is really clever, because we know she so desperately wanted to play piano or be an opera singer when she was young, and we know that there are shadows of the character of Jane Harding in that, and we know that she also basically came to the realization that she wouldn't be able to do it at the level that she, you know, the standard that she holds for herself. And that's why she kind of decides that's not the way her life's going to go. And then ultimately writing kind of fills that void to some degree. And I thought, in a way, Agatha's insecurity about not really knowing or not feeling like she knows the technicalities of music to as great a degree as maybe she could know them, meant that in a way she keeps the music, whilst the whole book is about music and genius, she keeps the music pretty much off page. She describes it in that big passage at the beginning, she describes the opera, and when Vernon has the idea for the opera, I don't know if you noticed, she reuses a lot of that language, and you're connecting it with that first description in the prologue, and you're going, oh, this is it, we're now coming to Giant Spread, this is where we've been heading this whole time in this beautiful cyclical structure. I will stop talking about structure in a minute, but I think it's so profound in this example. But yeah, I would argue to those critics that she knows that it's very hard to write about genius, and by extension musical genius and music, and therefore keeps it slightly unattainable, slightly out of reach, which is both how it feels to her individually, but also how Vernon feels, right? Like he's always striving for greater, for better.
It did strike me that I wondered if this thing about how difficult it is to talk about genius might be one of the reasons why the Giant Spread radio adaptation, which was on a few years ago, was, for me, and I know it wasn't just me, felt that it was an unusually weak one from BBC, because perhaps it's very difficult because you can't really represent genius because you're still in a BBC little recording studio. You can't have the listener saying, "Oh yes, I can hear this genius."
I think there are ways to do it. I agree that it wasn't necessarily successful. What's interesting in that radio adaptation for me is that they essentially changed the ending. There's clearly an insecurity about how much plot gets rattled through at the end of the book. So they actually end with the idea that the giant is almost the wrath coming to get Vernon. Which I think you described as melodramatic, and there's an argument for that. Although, like I say, I do think in the book, Westmacott is engaging in what she calls penny novelette style. But actually, that's not what the giant or the theme of genius is supposed to represent in the story. It's not coming to get...
No.
It's not coming to grind the bones of Vernon. That's a misunderstanding of the metaphor she's using. He is, in many ways, the giant.
Yes.
You recently gave me Gillian Gill's biography of Agatha Christie, which I've been loving. And something she says, and I think there's grounds for this, she says, remaining a virgin in Agatha Christie books is not the key to personal virtue or even to eternal redemption for a character. And I thought that's really true. And that's a very clear way in which Christie is ahead of her time, as she is in several ways. In this book, I think the clue to redemption, salvation is music or genius or faith, actually. Faith is another theme, which just reminded me again of how Christie actually stood out, I think, the sort of ideas that she had at the time. That's borne out, I think, by the end, in which it seems apparent that it's almost like love and the love storylines in the book. And this is why it's wrong to call it a romance, of course, is because it seems you're left with the feeling that love has been getting in the way the whole time. Because, you have that. So Jane's dead. Nell, he basically rejects and goes, let me get back to my work. And you end on that image of him scribbling away at his desk. And yeah, it is a little bit like a rejection of that kind of storytelling. And an investment in the pursuit of genius. I just want to put out one final quote on this subject from Jane, who is just so articulate on these things and so bold. She's sort of having a go at Nell about 2/3 of the way through the book. And she goes, Vernon had genius. No, and then corrects herself. That's the wrong way of putting it. He belonged to his genius. And genius is the hardest master there is. Everything has got to be sacrificed to it. Music wanted Vernon, and he's dead. But I tell you, it's got to be served. And of course, the irony being that Jane is also soon to be sacrificed, but also Vernon, it transpires, is not dead. And it's like he will be resurrected because the genius has to be served. That's the insight she has, right?
Nice, yes. So our next topic are emotions in relationships. Some news that I wrote this down. We share a document, we write our little notes. And I put, they are complex. We are expected to infer a lot. And Gray was like, yeah, that's a literary novel, Mark. It is. I know he's absolutely right. But it's just like the way that I was reading it thinking, oh, we really aren't being served up everything on the plate here.
No, and I do know what you meant.
Understand these personalities and the way they are. I guess because I'm thinking in Agatha Christie terms sometimes, not Mary Westmacott terms, where you're like, usually the inference is because it's a clue, it's being kept secret to us and it'll be revealed later. And you're like, aha, if you've been paying attention, you'd realise that's why she said that.
Yeah.
I think it's all about character.
Yes, I think it's also because of years of people deriding Christie as lesser than literary, that when we spot these things, we sort of go, oh, it's a novelty. But of course, in the wider context of things, it is just, of course, she writes that.
As with all the Westmacotts, what's interesting about the relationships is much less about romantic relationships and more about friendships and relationships within families.
Yeah.
So I thought there was a really interesting thing here about the group of the three of them, as you've already said, and that could it ever be a group of four, and the way that things are ingrained in childhood for some people that sort of keep on going.
Yes. Well, on that note, so I wanted to talk briefly about, I think Mary Westmacott is very interested in psychoanalysis, and I think and Freudian theories,
I'm sure,
were huge at this particular moment. And I think you can really feel that. I mean, following Vernon with all this psychological and emotional maturity and understanding from boy to man, there is a very clear psychoanalytical reading to be made of this book. Things like that we hear his parents are shadowy figures in his upbringing, and all this emphasis is on the succession of staff in the house and the nurses and his imaginary friends, which anachronistic maybe, but I'm thinking things like attachment theory and, you know, his naivety, which is so often a cause of wit in that early part, which, you know, actually there's a reading there about his growing knowledge. And there's a beautiful quote where the narrator says something like the world was widening for him. And there's a real sort of, and part of this reading, I think you spotted that reference to Mummy and Daddy being like a twin star that's breaking apart. Yes. That feels very Freudian to me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
And we mentioned the beast already as this kind of symbol that is threaded throughout. It's really cleverly evoked, isn't it? Because you see it through Vernon's eyes, but you become aware, I think someone refers to it being made of wires and bolts and wood, and you do know the perspective shift, so you know that it's a grand piano, but you see it through Vernon's eyes, so you feel like it is, and you feel like it's evil. And I thought this when I was reading it, and Janet Morgan agrees, that you could read the beast as kind of Vernon's equivalent of Agatha's gunman.
Oh, definitely.
Who pursues her through his childhood. Yeah. Who pursues her through her childhood. Yes.
But yes, that thing of just a recurring thing. But also and I'm going to grab my copy now. Because you know it's getting serious when I'm going to try and find a quote. Because this thing about being afraid of different things goes through it as well, because I noticed there are lots of things, references to being afraid of being in love. Yeah. That sort of fear. And so I'm going to find, it's page 230, it says here. Oh, here we go. This is Nell saying, I wish I'd never met Vernon. I wish I'd never loved him. I wish I didn't love him so much. I'm afraid. And that's a real sort of, because then we get from Vernon saying, it worried him from the first moment he had met her. He'd felt disturbed, afraid. She resented the effect she had on him, and yet was unwilling to admit how strong that effect was. This idea that they're almost like teenagers, you know, that they don't want to relinquish themselves to that bit of adulthood where they would actually have to make that final decision and say, no, this is my wife, my husband, this is the person I'm spending my life with. And I wonder how much of that is because of the interruption of things like the war later on, but their general instability, that it means you've got to make a quicker decision than you might otherwise have had to do.
Yeah. And it's a tumultuous world, isn't it? It's fin de siècle. It's the war, the March of War. I mean, I'm not quite sure where that point in the book comes exactly, but they can't be far off teenagers, because I mean, the whole span of the book is only about 32 years roughly.
Yeah,
I think.
That's very true. Also, there's this thing about the marriage and relationships have got this added pressure because of money. This thing about having to marry for money, having to marry to secure the future of houses and estates and all sorts of stuff, which, you know, I'm not going to sob too much for somebody who has to rent out their mansion. But I do think that is a familial pressure that you can understand being extremely stressful. This is why people marry cousins, right, in those days, because you kept the money in the family. Because once you've married out of the family, if you're the person with money, then that money is flowing somewhere else, not just towards, you know, you're not keeping your family secure, you're creating a new one. Whereas what about Great Aunt Ada and all of this sort of stuff? So you could feel that pressure, which I won't say, well, it does age it, but you could still understand it, because different people have pressures to marry for different reasons, or to at least
and in different cultures
down.
Today. Yeah, definitely.
So I thought that was really interesting. That it's not an easy, certainly not a romance, because there's so many barriers in the way to people falling in love and staying in love.
Well, I think that follows on neatly to, I think there's a lot of amazing character work in this, just little moments like what you just pulled out. And that's not to say, and none of this is to say that these things aren't necessarily evident in Agatha Christie books, but a hallmark of Mary Westmacott books and Agatha Christie books is excellent characterization, I think, and I think a real sophistication in that. You know, not just Jane, but there are some lovely moments with Jane. For example, I love the exchange about midway through. How many men have you lived with? And Jane says 1. And he was not a good man? Jane answered evenly, he was a very bad one. and that's all you get.
Yeah.
You know, the insight, the sophistication and the insight. Nell, at one point, we're talking about why Sebastian isn't attracted to Nell, and it's because we're told the real Nell hasn't happened yet. Perhaps she never will, which is just such a beautiful and tragic and devastating way to talk about someone developing. But it works, and it ties in with this psychoanalytical reading as well, I think, which I think gets capped off. All these themes of identity get capped off. And I mean, by the way, how relevant and fascinating that you would make a central spine of this book the theme of identity, when it's born essentially of a new identity, the Mary Westmacott identity, and what is that identity, and who am I as Agatha Christie, and all of these things that are swirling. But the theme of identity that's crystallized at the end of this book is, of course, Vernon, who doesn't believe he's Vernon. The gentleman's dead, isn't he? Vernon Dare is dead. I'm not Vernon. And they're reminding him who he is. He says he was best out of the way, so to speak, made rather a mess of things, hadn't he? And then we're told the frown deepened in an agony of attempted recollection. And, you know, who is Vernon Dare? Who is Mary Westmacott? Is he someone green? Is he Dutch? Is he English? Is he a Russian composer? All of these questions.
And dare we say, only a couple of years after Agatha Christie's own amnesia.
Yeah.
Her own time of...
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Him being hit by the truck, and then that whole episode feels very, very close to some of the facts around that case. Yeah. A theme of the book, and something that's quite a lot more complex and quite a lot more sensitive, actually, is faith in terms of Christianity, faith in terms of Judaism, but also there is a thread of anti-Semitism through the book, which we would be remiss not to talk about. A lot of ink has been spilled, well, not that much ink really, because part of the reason why we're doing this is because the Westmacotts aren't as talked about enough. But when people do talk about the Westmacotts, or the people that do pay attention to the Mary Westmacott books, I think sometimes tend to push this one away because it's felt that it's an anti-Semitic book. And I think that's not quite the full story, which is not to say that there aren't problems, and we'll talk about those now. But I think we're both in agreement, as well as invoking anti-Semitic aspects and portrayals, Christie is grappling with anti-Semitism as a theme as well. Is that fair to say?
Yes, we were chatting about this yesterday, and I guess first thing to say is that we're not Jewish, and I would be really interested to hear from anyone who is Jewish, especially like Jewish historians or people who can give us a bit more context from what we've read, but it's not a lived experience for us. So I'd be interested to know what other people think about it. But for me, this is a book that is about anti-Semitism that includes anti-Semitic language and incidents.
Yeah.
So that it can be and is both of those things. That it's not like some other novels by lots of people, including Christie, where of this era in particular, that you will get very casual anti-Semitic references to people, and especially in terms of character descriptions. But this is actually a book that's about how anti-Semitism completely informs the way that Sebastian's character develops. That actually that sense of him being an outsider, and his family, they were Jewish, that they have to conform in some way. They are Christian type Jews, I think they're referred to a lot at one point.
Yeah.
They're conforming, they're nice. Oh, that's okay, because they're not like, in quotation marks, those types of Jews. They are a particular type that seem to be acceptable to this sort of Middle England where they are.
That's true, although, I mean, there are anti-Semitic descriptions of those of that family.
Yes, absolutely.
In their physicality, which you say is common in and that's not an excuse. It's common in contemporary novels all the way through Christie's writing. It's a problem all the way through Christie's writing. The recurrent thing is Sebastian's face is yellowy.
Yes.
He's got big ears and he's got a lisp, and his mum has got a lisp. And also, I think what particularly felt egregious to me in this was that the lisp is used to mock the characters, right? To take the wind out of their sails. So there's that moment where Vernon and Joe go to explore Sebastian's grounds, and he sort of bursts out and tells them to sling their hook, and Christie's clearly writing in that lisp, and she writes it as well, which is horrible. Not, you wouldn't do it now, the TH and stuff instead of S. But what really bothered me was when that is used, for example, when Mrs. Levin, who has grown to know Vernon like a son, is grieving that Vernon has apparently died, and she says he's like a son, but says it in her lisp way. And you go, why are you mocking this character now in her moment of grief? It feels like that's when the depiction is uncomfortable. But like you say, thematically, she is trying to acknowledge that anti-Semitism exists.
Yes.
It's just the way she's doing it is at times very clumsy and offensive.
Completely agree. And it's funny that my memory is very much of those uncomfortable anti-Semitic descriptions. And it was only really upon rereading it that I realised how much she was trying to pick on that as a theme. But that is obviously not an excuse for any of the descriptions whatsoever.
Well, yeah, Gillian Gill points out that there are similar anti-Semitic descriptions in Sayers' Whose Body, which is pretty contemporaneous with this.
The thing about changing attitudes towards Jewish people is a real theme of the novel, especially when you think it's out in 1930, like we're 9 years before the Second World War. And so there's a couple of things that I noted. I'm on page 100 of my edition, if you want to read along. A sudden chill came over Vernon. He felt, without putting the thought into words, that he was talking to a member of an enemy race. And you'd think that idea of Jews being the enemy, to read that in 1930 in particular, is really quite a shocking thing to read.
I think, and I've said this on the Swinging Christies actually, but I think one of the major mistakes that people continue to make is believing that what happens in the Second World War happens, the camps are liberated in 1945, the world realises what has happened and sees it for this abysmal thing that it is, and anti-Semitism from then, if not is eradicated, then is lessened. And that's just not true. Actually, what happens is there's a lot of denial, a lot of misunderstanding. Even now, I hate to say this, there's a lot of denial of what happened, or at least rejection of it in terms of talking about it in a major way. And it's not until the 60s, this is why we've talked about it on the Swinging Christies, it's not until the Eichmann trial and the big publicised war crime trials that really break through into the mainstream news cycle with enough distance having passed for people in the early 60s before people actually face up to. But basically what I'm saying is like British people going, oh, we're as bad as them because there's anti-Semitism as rife in our society as there ever was in Germany. It didn't manifest itself in the same way, but it exists, and it still exists today.
Yeah.
And actually, the passage you just quoted, the reason why that's significant is because the fear that Vernon's having is that they've used some sort of quote-unquote Jewish influence to get the house. And that is a really problematic thought from Vernon, who we're supposed to sympathise with and follow. And whether he's friends with Sebastian or not, whether he changes his beliefs towards the end of the book, the whole book shows the Levins as rich, money obsessed, and conspiratorial in that way, which is a big problem.
Yes. That brings me to another point that I noted that's linked to that, which is also problematic in its own way, but it shows some sort of advance in the way that people are thinking, the characters in this book are thinking. So this is in the Jane section, and this is Jane talking to Sebastian, and Sebastian saying about his sort of feelings towards Joe. And Sebastian says, I'm rich, so she'd gain instead of lose if she married me, and being a Jew doesn't count against you much nowadays. It's even fashionable, said Jane, laughing. Now, what's really interesting about that is that you can read it and go, oh, well, times have clearly changed a bit for them. They see that actually it's not such a big problem as it was. But for me, in 2025, when we're recording this, just thinking about the idea that you would even have that discussion about, oh, is it all right, you know, like to have people from different faiths marrying together?
Yeah.
It feels like it's so low down on the list of things, you know, not even there on the list of things that I would be considering if someone said, Sebastian, are you in love with Joe? Yes. Oh, fantastic. That's all we really need to know.
Interesting you pick up on that. So Jane Arnold wrote an article in 1987 called Detecting Social History Jews in the Works of Agatha Christie, which is well worth a read. And obviously she devotes quite a considerable chunk of it to giant spread. And that's something she points out. She points out the only person that objects to mixed faith marriages is Sebastian's mum, which ties into what we were saying about the depiction of Sebastian's mum not being particularly generous. But she has some other great points. She talks about how the lisp is, quote, the natural result of applying an English accent to a Yiddish tav, which I didn't know. And she, like us, she's where we've got a lot of this research from. She talks about how Jews in Christie's books are often homely or even downright ugly. None of the Levin family are good looking. But then she also says, on the whole, Christie sees Jews as being rather more clever than ordinary, but then their intelligence is sometimes suspicious. Mm-hmm. Dare I say, if Christie's aping Dickens in Giant Spread, then maybe she's being inspired by other aspects of his books as well in this regard. Arnold also says Westmacott has a deep respect for Jews' artistic judgment, and that is one point in her favour, which is that Sebastian, in spite of all of this, is quite a likeable character, I think, and he's very impressive in terms of what he does. He's described as like the greatest showman. If I was Kemper, I'd cut in a clip here, but I'm not going to. Sorry, Kemper. And she concludes, as you've been saying, there is a tracking of changing attitudes towards Jewish people in these circles. I don't think we can extrapolate, like I say, a kind of historical reading from that, because I think the 20th century is a lot darker and more complicated than that. But Arnold does acknowledge, in the end, although the Levins are found to be socially acceptable, they are not ever admitted to intimacy, so it's not without caveats. It's worth saying that Thompson shows how when questions start being asked of the aspects of Agatha Christie's work that are anti-Semitic in the 40s and 50s, Giant Spread was used as a defence of that. Look at how she's put this Jewish character front and centre, and some of the depiction is okay. But I want to just leave the final note, if I may, on the question of flesh and being fleshy. It's an aspect of the depiction that Christie comes back to time and time again. You get yellow of face, and you get fleshy, and you get big ears, and you get lisp. And specifically, this is used for Sebastian in this book, and also Mrs. Levin. What I thought was interesting is the bread of the title is human flesh, right? So in the story, it's the giant is going to come and grind your bones into bread. So there is a sort of thematic reason as to why Christie continually refers to the fleshiness of some characters. And there is actually a very interesting moment where Herr Radmager, I think, sorry for any German people listening, is referred to as being as pinching Jane's flesh. Like everyone wants a bit of her because she's this incredible soprano. And similarly, I guess everyone wants a bit of Sebastian because he's rich and successful. And it is almost like the giant is, if not Vernon's genius, then it's Sebastian, who is a giant in his field. And invoking the flesh there, I think, is quite significant. It's interesting that I think and maybe positive, that it's not just Sebastian's flesh that Christie talks about. It's not just his body as an othering technique that is invoked. But it is true to say, when you take the Christie and the Westmacott books as a whole, that flesh is commonly used in connection with Jewish people as a means to other. But I think the overall point to take away is that the depictions are much more complicated. It's not worthy of wholesale cancellation, because actually what she's trying to do is more layered than you might first think.
I thought you were going with the bread about the communion, but flesh of Christ.
There's quite possibly an element of that as well, because there is also an element of Christianity. There's a strong thread of Christianity running throughout the book as well, isn't there? I mean, the continual mentions of God as an imaginary friend of Vernon's, which is interesting. Someone who's very Christian,
I thought
to imply that God is an imaginary friend.
Yes, but then we know from that letter that she had flexible ideas about what God might actually be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and is the giant in their lives actually God, and a Christian God more so than a Jewish God, or maybe both? There's lots of questions around that. I think Joe does say at one point, I noted, I can't see how any rational being can be anything but an atheist. So she clearly allows the characters to entertain different ideas.
Yes.
And music and faith is held up, Christian faith is held up alongside music as a different type of salvation. We're going to have a bit of a regular feature of recommending off the back of our experience of reading these books, aren't we? So, Giant's Bread, if you like this, try that. What are you thinking?
Well, I really only read crime fiction and gay fiction, so it's going to be an interesting mix as we go through this.
My one is gay as well.
Oh,
How
there
funny!
you go.
We're so predictable, Mark.
So I thought Patrick Gale's books, Mother's Boy and A Place Called Winter, the two that particularly sprang to mind. But those are books that are very much about sort of finding yourself in the world and other people's relationships, like tonally and emotionally, they've got a lot in common. So yes, I would say they're both very good books as well, so I would recommend them regardless.
Which one are you reading now?
I can't remember.
Because is it Take Nothing With You?
Yes, it is.
That's very this.
Oh,
That's what I thought you were going to say when you said Patrick Gale, because I'm fairly sure his mother is a musician, isn't she?
I don't know.
And it has different perspectives.
I've read like one chapter.
It's so interesting because I loved Take Nothing With You. I really struggled with Mother's Boy and A Place Called Winter.
How funny.
So I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Yeah.
But funnily enough, my recommendation is a very similar writer to Gale, which is Alan Hollinghurst. He very much writes in the tradition of James, of Woolf, of War, and all of those, I think, feel very much of a piece with Giant's Bread. But what sprung out to me was his most recent novel, Our Evenings, which does a similar thing of following a sort of boy to man, a Bildungsroman like this book is, takes in the history of the time, but also cycles through those times very much structurally, very much like what Westmacott is doing here. Yeah, so on the basis of Giant's Bread, what image are we conjuring so far of Mary Westmacott specifically?
Someone who loves art, somebody who's really interested in psychology. Those are really big things. Someone who's been through some sort of trauma of some kind. I think that, we know it's sort of relationship trauma, but you can tell that there's been the loss of her mother, that seems to be a big thing. Someone who's really interested in people and the way that people's psychology manifests itself. In this case, a lot of it is through music, but also, of course, the way that people act and stuff.
I second all of that. I mean, a great mind, which... spoilers make sense given what we know.
Yes.
Also, I mean, just on a sort of granular level, someone that, and I'm really looking forward to following this thread because I think there's maybe a lot in this. Someone that's obsessed with yew trees and the symbolism that yew trees are for, because yew trees are fascinating. There's so many things that they stand for something quite different in popular culture now, but something you can really follow an interesting thread. And we know that the fourth book is called The Rose and the Yew Tree. And I'm really excited to see how this symbol evolves. Because and please write in, I'm sure I'm wrong, I can't think of yew trees being invoked as a symbol in Agatha Christie's. I'd love it if it turned out that this is a Mary Westmacott specific symbol.
I'm going to have a think about that now.
Yeah, or at the very least, I think they're going to stand for something different in this particular mode of writing, and I'm really excited to follow that reading and see where we go.
Nice. One ready for the mailbag. So do please read along with us, because in 2 weeks from today, we are going to be covering Unfinished Portrait. Every episode drops every other Tuesday. So let us know your thoughts. We'd also love to see your copies of the books, because I think particularly Westmacott's, because they are published sometimes as if they're Agatha Christie's, internationally in particular, but sometimes just absolutely slightly bonkers covers or ones that don't really fit it at all. So show us your copies. We'd love to see that.
Definitely.
You can at us on Instagram or Blue Sky or whatever. We'll give you our details shortly. And we are going to have a mailbag in our wrap-up episode as well. So please do drop us a line if you've got anything. There's always going to be stuff we've missed. So tell us anything that you think we've missed that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah. Just tell us what you think of each book.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear what people think of Giant's Bread. Ultimately, I think we both really enjoyed it on the whole.
Absolutely.
Certainly more than we thought so.
Yeah, because when I first read it, for me, years ago, it was the weakest of the Westmacotts. And I've enjoyed it more the more I've read it.
Please pre-order the Swinging Christie's book. That's coming. So we're still doing the Swinging Christie's. There's still regular episodes dropping of that. So stay subscribed to that feed too. And you'll get updates of both Westmapod and Swinging Christie's on our socials, which are... Take it away.
You can find us on Instagram at Christie_time. Our Blue Sky account is at christietime.bsky.social. You can email us at christietimepod@gmail.com. Our website is christietime.com. Gray's website is grayrobertbrown.wixsite.com/grayrobertbrown. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Mark Aldridge and also on Blue Sky at markaldridge.info, which is also my website.
And also don't forget to rate, review and click subscribe.
Oh yes, please do. Yes,
on both
we're on a new feed now.
Yeah,
so we've got two feeds going. So please do follow both.
Swinging Christie's and Westmapod. They're available on all podcatchers everywhere, every single one, even ones that don't exist.
Yeah, we'll track them down.
Yeah, we'll get you somehow. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye. Westman bye.
No.
Westman gone.
No.
Oh, Westman no.
It's quite funny. Thanks for listening to Giant's Bread. Westmapod is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 17th of August 2025. Our artwork is designed by Tom Double and our music is by Dar Golan.
Quite right.
Are we going to have a whole
I would be interested
jam cream
to
debacle?
hear what people think. I think that's the most tedious conversation. It absolutely drives me
Really?
mad.
Because I was about to cue it up.
Please don't do it.
Maybe we could do that for the Coda.
It's one of the things I absolutely hate. Well, how do you say scone or scone? Which way around do you have the cream and the jam? Do what you like. There's no right way to do anything. Honestly, eat what you want.
That is true. Although...
So tedious. And people think it's a really funny thing to discuss and like that's right and that's wrong, and it's that thing of what do you call a roll? Is it a bap? Is it a oh god, it's so boring. You see it all the time.
Did you wake up on the wrong side of the bed this morning?
But you see it all the time. People are trying to do, it's like an online clickbait sort of thing, but to make people give a response to something. It's a, let's settle this once and for all. What should we really call this? And it's like a picture of what I would call a roll. And of course, people from various areas go, no, it's a bap. No, it's a balm. No, it's whatever.
I think you've got too much time on your hands if you're looking at these things. Why aren't
you bloody doing research rather than distracting yourself with all that nonsense?